Well, Democrats and Republicans from 16 U.S. states are heading to the polls today to choose their preferred presidential candidate for the November election. Over 1,200 delegates are needed to win the Republican nomination. Nearly 2,000 is the magic number for the Democrats. The current president, Joe Biden, is the leading contender for the Democratic nomination. Donald Trump, the former president, is up against Nikki Hayley in the Republican nominee race. Well, the dominance that Trump has over the Republican Party is probably going to be confirmed tonight. Professor John Stremlau is an honorary professor of international relations at Wits University. Professor Stremlau, good afternoon to you. Is this going to be the night when Donald Trump is confirmed, really, as the Republican nominee and Nikki Hayley finally pulls out?
It looks to be that way, Stephen, and Nikki Hayley is polling better than either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, and the most unpopular candidates that have run for high office in memory. And why are they so far ahead? Well, it's because of the primary system, which was instituted in the 1950s in order to democratize. But in fact, it's favored the extremist groups that show up to vote in the primaries.
It's really astonishing. You've got one candidate, as you say, that polls really well. You've got Biden and Trump, who have run against each other before. And it looks almost inevitable. I mean, it's been inevitable for about a year, maybe 18 months, that barring accidents and court cases, it's going to be a rerun.
Well, it's worse than that, Stephen, because you have Donald Trump, who didn't accept the outcome of the last election, now running again, and the prospect of, if he won, of having an unreliable and unpredictable president in the United States, which historians have considered to be the worst president in the history of America, going back 235 years, is amazing to me. But there you are, and we have 50 different electoral management bodies in each of the states, so that it's really kind of nutty.
Why has Hayley stayed in for so long? Is she expecting something to happen? Is she receiving large amounts of money to keep her in the race somehow?
Yes, that's a very astute comment. She is getting donor money. There are Republicans who don't like Donald Trump, and she's been championing them. However, Donald Trump has 276 electoral votes already and will likely get most of the 874 that are in contention for this primary Super Tuesday. And yet she has been rallying to remind everyone that Trump is unacceptable. So I like that fact that she's been hanging in there, but I expect that she will probably pull out after tonight's results are known.
The U.S. Supreme Court last night, and I must remind myself that 3 of the judges on the Supreme Court were actually appointed by Trump, but now the Supreme Court has overturned a decision by the Supreme Court in Colorado. The Supreme Court in Colorado, as I understand it, said Trump was ineligible to be on the ballot in that state because he had been involved in an insurrection. There's a long history to this particular law in Colorado. It goes back to the end of the U.S. Civil War. Now he's back on the ballot, obviously. How important is that decision by the Supreme Court?
It's a tricky decision in the sense that it was 9-0, so that the liberals and the conservatives agreed that we can't have states deciding individually who's going to be on the ballot and who's not going to be on the ballot. But, you know, the conservatives on the court are originalists, and they go back to the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Constitution is pretty clear on this. He did foment an insurrection in January 6, 2021. And there's no denying that, and yet he's running and claims to be a Democrat in the small d, but it is really an autocrat with a capital A, and I think is going to be really disastrous for the United States and for partners and friends abroad as well as adversaries, because it'll be so unpredictable. Except Vladimir Putin will be happy.
It's interesting to watch this election because we've sort of seen it before in a way. Very rare that this happens. One of the intriguing questions for me is that in the last election, the last time we saw Trump and Biden go up against each other, Trump actually won more votes than any other person in the presidential election before him, except for Biden. In other words, more votes were cast in the last U.S. presidential election than ever before. Biden, of course, won. Do you think the same thing will happen, or do you think American voters are getting tired of it?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and we won't know until the actual vote occurs. But you're right, he did get 70 million votes, and Biden got 77 million votes. But what we're talking about in the few handful of swing states was 200,000 or less that gave Biden the electoral college majority. Donald Trump, in one of his franker moments, has admitted that no Republican could win a popular vote, and South Africans prize elections that are popularly decided, not decided by a crazy apportionment among the provinces. And among the states, it favors rural states, smaller states, that get the electoral college advantage. And it's crazy, but what Trump is trying to do is to have minority rule in perpetuity, and that is not a good recipe for a democracy that is supposed to have all votes equal.
We've seen what happened with the United States and Donald Trump is sort of one example of sort of populism. I'll call it right-wing populism, if I may. We saw it in Brazil. We saw it in the UK, I'd argue, with Boris Johnson. We've seen it in other parts of Europe and Italy. We're seeing the rise of a right-wing party under Marine Le Pen in France. There were some hopes that perhaps the era of populism might be coming to an end. Jair Bolsonaro is no longer president in Brazil. Lula da Silva is. In Italy, it seems the prime minister there, Meloni, is governing in a much more moderate way than people had expected. France, difficult to know exactly what will happen there. Britain probably looks like Labour will win the elections there and take over from the Conservative Party. But a lot of these trends come from the U.S. The U.S. has often set the tone for Western politics, if I can sort of make quite a bold statement. Is there still such big support for populism in the West, and is America still setting the tone for that?
Well, it's interesting. I tend to think that these phenomenon are global right now because of the uncertainties of global change and the politics of democracies always have a risk of demagoguery, and that's true here as well as anywhere else. But I do think that if the South Africans have a decent election on May 29th, and there is a reasonable coalition, if you will, that emerges from that, and the U.S. elects Joe Biden, that the two poles here of the North and the South could be constructive signals to the rest of the world. Now, Freedom House has said that illiberalism is still on the march, and it's been on the march for 17 years, Stephen, so it's not a new phenomenon. But it may be a time for a swing, and so we keep our fingers crossed for here, and we keep our fingers crossed for the Americans on the other side of the Atlantic, and we'll have to wait and see until after the elections.
Professor John Stremlau, thank you. Really appreciate the time. Honorary Professor of International Relations at Wits University. Thanks very much indeed. Well.